Greetings to all of you listening. I am Lord Greggor of Vale Keep, and I will be sharing a story that Lady Zelda wrote in October of 2019. She won an award for this story, and many of you lately have been requesting to hear it. Lady Zelda and I are happy to bring it to you now, and we hope you will enjoy it. In the year 1661, the HMS William Cross was commissioned for an uncharted and undocumented voyage, departing from the port of Plymouth, England, and bound for Bally Castle Harbour in County Antrim, Ireland. Aboard the vessel was cargo intended for trade between governments and royalty: butter, salt, gold, silver, and slaves from Algiers. There was, however, an understanding made before the ship ever left port. Should the William Cross encounter hardship, become disabled, or vanish somewhere upon the sea, neither royal nor governmental assistance would be summoned on her behalf. No written guarantee protected the men aboard her. It was merely a verbal agreement, one that would eventually disappear from official history and survive only as legend. The voyage was not fully commissioned, nor was the complement of officers complete. It was considered a volunteer sailing, ordered by the king and expected to make a quick passage and return. Captain Joseph Ian Darcy was given command of the vessel, with First Lieutenant Samuel P. Harris serving beneath him. A second lieutenant had been expected to report on the morning of departure, but he never arrived. That left only Darcy and Harris to command the ship, and Harris immediately assumed the additional responsibilities of executive officer. The crew was another matter entirely. Each man had been promised payment in gold upon arrival at their destination, provided, of course, that they actually reached it. That promise brought more volunteers than might otherwise have been expected. Some were strong, disciplined men with previous naval experience. Others had come because they were homeless, hungry, or simply searching for a roof over their heads and a meal in their stomachs. They could not have known that even provisions aboard the ship would prove scarce. Englishmen sailed beside Spaniards, Algerians, and Romanians. The difficulty of communication became apparent almost immediately. Translators had to be found among the crew themselves, and fortunately there were a few men capable of picking their way through enough of the various languages to make certain that orders were understood and duties performed. Yet the greatest difficulty may have been the ship herself. The HMS William Cross was no proud new vessel of His Majesty's Navy. She had previously been rated out of commission and was classified as a sixth rate, capable of berthing approximately 200 men but carrying only 20 guns. She was hardly the vessel one would expect to be chosen for a mission of importance, and certainly not one prepared for serious trouble at sea. To Captain Darcy and Lieutenant Harris, the circumstances made little sense. There were too few provisions, too few officers, inadequate firepower, and the crew gathered from wherever willing men could be found. And it was enough to make either officer wonder whether the cargo was truly the purpose of the voyage at all. Perhaps there was another reason the William Cross had been chosen. Perhaps there was another reason these particular men had been placed aboard her. Whatever doubts they carried, they had accepted their commission. The crew had taken their bargain. The ship was prepared. And this was their story. On the morning of the 11th of May, 1661, the HMS William Cross finally left Plymouth and turned toward the open sea. For a time, there was little indication of what awaited them. There was salt upon the air, the songs of sailors drifting across the deck, and wind filling the sails above them. The officers navigated toward their destination and understood only that, if they succeeded, this voyage would become far more than an ordinary passage between two ports. Yet something about its timing troubled them. Only days remained before King Charles II was to marry the Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza. England was preparing for celebration, ceremony, and a royal marriage. Why then, at such a moment, would an aging, previously decommissioned ship carrying an incomplete command and a ragtag crew suddenly be ordered from Plymouth on an undocumented voyage? There had to be a reason, and the answer was already aboard the HMS William Cross.
During my travels, I was led to a small coastal harbour in Northern Ireland, Ballycastle, County Antrim. There was something strangely beautiful about it: rugged cliffs, endless green, and the unpredictable Atlantic Ocean, perfectly calm one moment, wild with whitecaps the next. But almost immediately, Ballycastle affected me in a way I could not explain. I walked for some time without really paying attention to where I was going, until I found myself standing in an open stretch of emerald green grass overlooking the sea. And suddenly I stopped. A feeling of dread came over me, then regret, then something even stranger, love and anger at the same time. I had no reason to feel any of it. I was alone. I had never been there before. Yet the emotions felt almost familiar, as though they belonged to someone else, and I had somehow walked directly into them. I sat upon a rock, facing the Atlantic, as the bright sky above me slowly began to change, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely consumed by longing, loneliness, regret, and then fear and horror.
While the seas had been calm when the HMS William Cross departed Plymouth, there was very little calm to be found aboard her decks. Arguments among the crew became almost constant, carrying from one end of the ship to the other by day and continuing well into the night. With every passing mile, the men became more suspicious of the voyage they had agreed to undertake. What had been presented as a simple cargo passage no longer felt like one. It felt instead like a mission, and worse still, a mission from which someone had already decided they were never meant to return. The crew knew they were isolated. The officers were badly outnumbered, and even Captain Darcy and Executive Officer Harris could feel the strain growing around them. Questions began to spread among the men. Why continue toward Ballycastle at all? Why not make for another harbor and disappear? The cargo aboard the William Cross: butter, salt, gold, silver, and slaves from Algiers, represented enough wealth to purchase entirely new lives somewhere far beyond England. And if the ship had never been intended to return, who would come searching for them? No rescue vessel would be dispatched. No royal inquiry would be launched. No one would even know precisely where they had gone. The men understood what that meant. They believed themselves doomed. And if they were doomed already, some began asking why they should continue obeying anyone at all. Then came the morning of the 2nd of June, 1661. Cries erupted from below deck and tore through the berthing quarters, the cabins, and finally onto the open deck itself. Men scrambled from their hammocks and posts. Others shouted questions that no one could answer. Even the lookout heard the panic rising from within the ship. Executive Officer Samuel P. Harris had only just begun to stir when a frantic pounding sounded at his cabin door. "Enter," Harris called. "What say you?" Harris rose from his desk. "Good God, man, what is happening down there?" The crewman swallowed hard before answering. "Sir, this does not seem to have come from our good God." He hesitated, as though even speaking the words aloud frightened him. "It seems more the work of the devil himself." Perplexed by the sailor's warning, Harris prepared quickly, fastened the belt that held his sword, and followed the crewman below deck into the damp, musty darkness of the berthing quarters. The air there was heavy, the light poor, and the fear among the men almost palpable. What Harris found waiting for him was not what he had expected. A Spanish shipmate lay before them, a man whose name Harris did not know. His skin had become unnaturally pale, dark circles surrounded his eyes, and his hair was matted heavily against his head. His face itself seemed altered. His cheeks had sunk deeply inward, his hands were thin and almost skeletal, and the body that had left Plymouth only weeks earlier appeared to have lost an impossible amount of weight. His clothing now hung loosely around him, several sizes too large for the man he had once been. Harris examined him in silence, trying to understand what kind of illness could have changed a healthy sailor so completely and so quickly. Nothing about the body resembled ordinary sickness, starvation, or death at sea. He finally turned away, intending to retrieve Captain Darcy, when the crewman stopped him. "Sir, there is one more thing you should see." The sailor carefully drew back the tattered collar from the Spaniard's neck. There, against the pale skin, were two small, fresh punctures. Harris stared at them. "There be two more just like it on his left hand, sir," the man said quietly. "What should we do?" Harris had no answer that would bring the sailor any comfort. "I am going to the captain's quarters. In the meantime, stay here and pray." The crewman did exactly that, although prayer was not the only thing occupying his mind. While he remained beside the body, he found an old glass bottle and began gathering every scrap of writing he could manage. He recorded what had happened aboard the William Cross, writing notes wherever he could find room, adding small drawings and fragments of detail that might one day explain what had taken place upon the ship. He did not know whether anyone would ever read them. He did not even know whether he himself would live long enough to finish the account. But he had already begun to suspect that someone needed to know. His intention was simple. When the right moment came, he would place everything inside the bottle, seal it as best he could, and throw it into the sea. Perhaps the currents would carry it somewhere. Perhaps it would wash ashore in England, Ireland, or some distant place he would never see. He had no family waiting for him, and no one he believed would come searching if the William Cross disappeared. Yet he understood that what was happening aboard that ship could not be allowed to disappear with them. In his heart, the crewman had already accepted something the others were still struggling to admit. He did not believe he would survive the voyage. Perhaps the bottle would. By then, Captain Joseph Ian Darcy was fully awake, and already aware that something had gone terribly wrong aboard his ship. Rumors had moved quickly through the crew, and panic was beginning to spread from one deck to another. Darcy knew his trusted executive officer would come to him as soon as he understood what had happened, and rather than step into a frightened crowd without knowing precisely what he was facing, the captain returned to his quarters and waited. Harris, meanwhile, made his way through the narrow passages and crowded interior of the William Cross, his thoughts fixed upon the body he had just examined and the two strange marks upon the dead man's neck. When at last he reached the captain's cabin, he knocked. Darcy did not keep him waiting. "Come in, Harris," he called, "and fill me in, quickly."
The sun was beginning its final descent, streaking the horizon with orange and gold until the sea looked almost jeweled. I remained seated on the jagged rock when something appeared far out in the distance. A ship. At first I thought it might simply be passing Bally Castle, but there were no other vessels around it. I squinted, trying to bring it into focus. It looked unlike any ship I had ever seen. Full masts, old rigging, and standing near the forecastle was a man dressed like an officer, wearing a blue and gold uniform that looked as though it belonged in a history book. I remember thinking, how old is that uniform? The stranger part was that the ship seemed to disappear, then reappear. I blamed my eyes. I had been staring across the water for too long, and the fading light could easily have been playing tricks on me. But then the vessel appeared again, closer this time, and I could see the officer more clearly. He was looking directly toward the cliff, toward me. A chill ran through me because somehow I knew him. I had no idea who he was, but I knew him. Then he raised his arm. A cannon fired. I stood and raised my own arm toward him, waving almost instinctively. He saw me. I know he did. For one brief moment, we were looking directly at one another across the water. And then the ship vanished.
By the time Captain Darcy and Executive Officer Harris returned below, the shouting had become impossible to ignore. Cries echoed through the passageways. Men were yelling over one another, some in English, others in languages neither officer could understand. Whatever uneasiness had existed aboard the William Cross before had now become something far more dangerous. Panic. When Darcy and Harris reached the berthing area where Harris had first examined the Spaniard, they stopped. The body was gone. So was the crewman Harris had ordered to remain beside it. For several seconds, neither officer spoke. Then movement came from the corner of the room. Another crewman was hiding there, pressed against the wall as though he were trying to disappear into it. Darcy motioned for him to come forward, but the young man could barely move. His eyes were wide with terror. His mouth opened, yet no words followed. Darcy and Harris sat him down. "Come on, son," Darcy said. "Pull yourself together. Tell us everything. Take your time." Harris handed him a cup of water. After several ragged breaths, the young sailor finally managed to speak. "My name is Riley, sir. Could you remember that, so you can tell my mother?" Darcy's expression changed. "Yes, of course we shall. Now, Riley, tell us everything you know, slowly. I want to hear all of it." But whatever Riley had witnessed had already pushed him beyond reason. "We have no time, sir. None," he cried. "It's over. Life. It's over, sir. It's over." He leapt to his feet and ran for the doorway, knocking into tables and forcing his way past other crewmen before disappearing into the passage. Darcy turned on the remaining men. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here? I want an explanation, and I want it now." Harris immediately reinforced the captain's command. No one was to leave. No one was to move until the officers understood what had taken place aboard their ship. At last, several men stepped forward. Unfortunately, they all began speaking at once, English mixed with Spanish, Romanian, and other tongues. The room became a confusion of frightened voices, gestures, accusations, and half-understood descriptions of things neither officer had ever encountered before. Yet one thing required no translation. Fear. It was there in every language. Harris raised his voice above the others. "One man. I need one man to speak for all of you. Someone who saw what happened. Tell us what took place during the night and into the early hours of this morning." The room gradually quieted. Then the young blonde sailor returned. His blue eyes were still wide with fear, and he had the look of a boy who expected to be punished simply for repeating what he had seen. He nodded. "Sirs, my name is Riley Bagman, Jr. After my father, sirs." Harris softened his voice. "Go on, mate Bagman." Riley swallowed. "Well, sirs, it went like this. Most of us were asleep down here. Only a few were awake because of the watch and the movement of the ship. Then we noticed one of the foreign crew walking about. He glanced at the men around him. He looked as though he were asleep, but walking at the same time. Back and forth, sirs, back and forth. Darcy listened without interruption. Some of us pretended to be sleeping so we could watch him. We had never seen him do it before. Otherwise, we would have reported him. Continue, Harris said. Riley nodded. He began stopping beside the hammocks, beside the pallets, looking down at the men who were sleeping. Those of us watching knew something was wrong, but we stayed quiet because we wanted to see what he was doing. His voice began to tremble. Then, before we knew it, he pounced upon the sleeping Spaniard. Riley looked at Darcy. It happened so fast, sir. The poor man never knew what struck him. A silence fell over the room. His blood was gone. Darcy stared at him. Wait, what? Riley did not answer quickly enough. How do you know it was blood? What happened next, man? Riley forced himself to continue. Before we knew it, the foreigner was walking again. Then he let out a cry and went topside. We could see his face, sirs. Riley paused. It was covered in the Spaniard's blood. No one moved. We were too frightened to stop him. We were frozen. Darcy and Harris exchanged a look. Neither officer allowed the crew to see what they were thinking. But both had arrived at the same immediate conclusion. Whatever strange story these men believed, there was now a killer loose aboard the William Cross, and he had to be found. Darcy and Harris divided the available men into search parties. Darcy would take one group while Harris took another. Riley remained with Harris. As they prepared to leave, something occurred to the executive officer. Someone tell me the name of the crewman I left beside the Spaniard. Who was he? Where is he? Riley answered, Sir, his name is Billy. That's all we know. And where is Billy now? Riley hesitated. Well, sir, there was one part I didn't finish. The part about the Spaniard. Harris slowly turned toward him. What about the Spaniard? Riley looked toward his shipmates as though needing confirmation that he had not imagined it. They were already nodding. I'm not certain you want to hear this, sir. We didn't believe it ourselves. Harris said nothing. Riley continued. When the foreigner finished with him and went topside, the Spaniard rose from his bed. Harris stared at him. And? He followed him, sir. For the first time, Harris felt the strength leave his legs. There were no stores of drink aboard sufficient to explain what these men claimed to have witnessed. No drunken frenzy. No bottle of spirits that could account for an entire room of sailors telling the same impossible story. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke again. Riley, I heard what you said. Now tell me where Billy is. The moment Billy saw that Spaniard get up, sir, he ran like a frightened rabbit. A few nervous chuckles escaped from the men around them. Harris silenced them with a single look. For the last time, where is Billy now? Riley's expression became serious again. Sir, the last we saw of him, he was at the bow. Harris waited. Doing what? Riley swallowed. Throwing something overboard, sir. A beat of silence passed. That's the last we saw of Billy. Gather your knives and clubs, mates. We're going hunting. What followed aboard the HMS William Cross would be remembered by the few who survived not in hours but in fragments.
After several hours on the cliffs, my stomach finally reminded me that I had forgotten the picnic I had planned. It was getting late, so I began making my way carefully down toward Bally Castle in search of a pub. The fading light made every step along the rocks more difficult. Before leaving the shore behind, I looked toward the sea one more time. The ship had returned, but now it looked badly damaged. The officer still stood near the forecastle, no longer wearing his formal coat. A sword was in his hand, and although I could not hear him, I could see him shouting orders. Then I realized what I had mistaken for damaged rigging. There were bodies among the masts. Some were motionless, others were not. I froze. What was I looking at? And why did I have the overwhelming feeling that the officer aboard that ship was in terrible danger? A hand touched my shoulder. I nearly jumped. A young man stood beside me. "Miss, are you all right there? You've been staring at that sunset like you know it personally." I laughed nervously. "I'm sorry. I suppose I got caught up in the view. Is there somewhere nearby where I can get a pint and something to eat?" He smiled. "That sounds like a fine idea. Come along. I'll take you." A few minutes later, we reached a weathered old pub called the Crown and Goose. Warm light and music spilled through the doorway. The moment I walked inside, everyone seemed to notice me. I found an empty booth and sat down. The barkeep approached with a smile. "Miss, you look like you need a pint or two. I'll get you settled while you decide what you're eating." That sounded perfect. While I looked over the menu, something above the bar caught my attention. Inside a glass case sat an old, thick green bottle, and written near the bottom was one word: Billy. I remember staring at it for a moment. Then my food arrived and hunger won. Fresh cheese, mustard, sausages, soda bread, and a dark pint beside it. After everything I had experienced that afternoon, it felt like the best meal I had ever eaten. For a while I forgot about the ship, the officer, the cannon fire, and the things I had seen hanging from those masts. Later that night, I returned to my room at the Bally Castle Inn. With the window open toward the sea, I could hear the waves striking the rocks below and feel the cold coastal air drifting into the room. Before long, I fell asleep. And for the first time since arriving in Bally Castle, everything was quiet.
He glanced toward whatever direction he believed land might lie. "We should be close to Bally Castle, sir. We should be close." Riley lowered his voice. "I'm praying for us, sir. I'm praying." During the previous 2 days, the sickness had spread through the crew with astonishing speed. Whatever had come aboard the ship showed no preference for rank, nationality, age, or loyalty. And finally, Harris and Riley understood where it had begun. The Spaniard had been the first victim. The man who attacked him had been Romanian, but he had not been the only one. The Romanians who boarded the William Cross had brought the sickness with them. Whatever condition lay dormant within them had remained hidden only for a time. And once it emerged, there was no containing it. The crew fought bravely at first. Starved by dwindling provisions and exhausted by days without proper rest, they nevertheless defended one another. Men who had argued only days earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder, protecting shipmates whose languages they could scarcely understand. Captain Joseph Ian Darcy remained at the helm for as long as he was able. Even as chaos overtook his ship, Darcy attempted to steer the William Cross toward Bally Castle. Perhaps, if he could bring her close enough to land, someone might see them. Someone might come to their aid. Captain Darcy never lived to know whether he succeeded, but the ship continued onward. Slowly, almost impossibly, the battered HMS William Cross continued toward the coast of Bally Castle. And aboard her, the dead did not remain dead. Men who had fallen during the fighting began to rise again. Those they attacked would soon rise as well, and with every new victim their numbers increased. The remaining crew fought desperately to keep them back. Some men were lost outright. Others were left hanging among the rigging and masts, as terrible warnings to those still alive. The once proud vessel became almost unrecognizable. The decks were fouled by the aftermath of battle. The air itself had become nearly unbearable, heavy with seawater, decay, smoke, sweat, and death. Harris and Riley wrapped scarves and torn pieces of cloth across their noses and mouths simply to breathe. They learned to watch one another constantly. One would move while the other watched. One would sleep while the other remained awake. And slowly they discovered something else. They could sense when one of the creatures was near. There was a smell to them now. A presence. Something that warned Harris and Riley before the creatures emerged from the darkness. Their appearance had changed as well. Their eyes were swollen and bloodshot, their faces drained of life, and the hunger within them seemed to grow more violent with every attack. Yet, with each sunrise, something extraordinary happened. The fighting diminished, the creatures withdrew, and for a few precious hours Harris and Riley were allowed to breathe. It was during one of those brief periods of daylight that Harris finally made his decision. "We have to make it topside, Riley," he whispered. Riley looked at him but said nothing. "Be mindful of everything around you. Trust no one. We know what they smell like now. We know when they are coming." Harris tightened the scarf around his face and checked the sword at his side. "If we can reach the open deck, we have a chance." He looked directly into Riley's frightened eyes. "Come now, son." Then, more quietly, "It is time to put courage ahead of thought." Riley nodded. There was nothing left to say. Neither man knew what waited above them. Neither knew whether the HMS William Cross had truly reached the waters near Bally Castle. Neither knew if they would ever stand upon land again. And neither man knew whether his next breath would still belong to the living, or whether he would soon join the silent ranks of the undead. With what little strength remained to them, Harris and Riley ran. They forced their way through the wreckage and confusion below deck, slipping through the mire and destruction until at last they reached the stairway leading topside. The double doors above stood open. Both men stopped. Beyond them, hanging impossibly low in the night sky, was an enormous full moon. Its pale light poured through the opening and down into the stairwell, giving them just enough illumination to climb. Step by step they ascended. Then they reached the top and stopped in horror. Dawn was still several hours away, but already the approaching morning seemed to have quieted some of the violence aboard the ship. Waiting for them upon the open deck was what remained of the crew. Only they were no longer the men who had left Plymouth. Among them stood the Romanian sailors who had brought the sickness aboard the William Cross. They remained near the front of the gathering, snarling at Harris and Riley as though they understood perfectly well what stood before them. The last two living men aboard the ship, and among the undead crew stood Captain Joseph Ian Darcy. Harris could scarcely comprehend what he was seeing. His captain, his commanding officer, his friend, now one of them. There was no time to mourn him. Darcy came toward him, and Harris reacted as the naval officer he had been trained to be. His sword came free, and in the struggle that followed, Harris struck the final blow that ended Captain Darcy's advance. The captain fell. For only a moment, Harris looked down at him. Darcy had lost his formal dress coat somewhere during the fighting. His coal black hair had fallen wild around his face. And even after everything that had happened aboard the ship, something recognizable remained of the handsome officer he had once been. Darcy had always drawn attention wherever he went. With his dark hair and striking blue eyes, he had been a favorite among the ladies, many of whom had once imagined themselves the woman who might finally persuade him to settle down. Darcy, however, had shown little interest. The sea had seemed to claim more of him than any woman ever could. And when his ship fell into chaos, his formal Royal Naval training did not make him timid. Quite the opposite. Captain Darcy had fought with everything he possessed, abandoning ceremony and rank when necessary to become simply another man defending the lives around him. Now those lives had been reduced to two: Samuel Harris and Riley Bagman. There was no time for either man to consider the captain's death. The first light of sunrise had begun to appear. As the sky brightened, the Romanian undead and the others began retreating from the open deck, disappearing into the darker levels of the ship below. Harris and Riley finally had a moment to look around them. Only then did they understand the true condition of the HMS William Cross. She was ruined. Her decks were damaged beyond repair. Rigging hung loose. Timber had been broken and splintered. Evidence of the fighting lay everywhere. As sunlight began breaking through the morning clouds, it illuminated what remained of the once stately vessel. And it illuminated the men who had not survived her. Some still hung among the rigging and masts, terrible remnants of the struggle that had consumed the ship. Harris recognized many of them. Men he had spoken with, men to whom he had given orders, men who had stood beside him only hours before. Nearby lay Captain Darcy. Harris could do nothing for any of them now. Then Riley shouted, "Sir!" Harris turned. "A ship! Sir, there's a ship!" Riley pointed frantically toward the horizon. "We're saved!" Then his excitement faltered. "But she's too far away, sir. She may never see us. What shall we do?" Harris ran toward the forecastle and climbed high enough to see beyond the damaged rigging. Riley was right. There, through the morning mist, was another vessel. Far away. Far enough that the crew aboard her could easily pass without ever realizing that the William Cross was in distress. Harris stared toward her, searching desperately for some way to draw attention. They needed noise. Something unmistakable. Something powerful enough to carry across the water. Then the morning mist shifted again. Beyond the distant ship, Harris saw something else. Land. A rocky shoreline. For the first time in days, hope returned to him. They had reached the waters near Bally Castle. Perhaps not close enough, but close. And if Harris could make that other ship turn toward them, he and Riley might yet have a chance. He spun around and ran back across the deck. As he passed Riley, Harris shouted, "Follow me to the cannons, friend." Riley immediately ran after him. "That is our chance." Harris pointed toward the remaining guns. "Our only chance for survival."
Morning came beautifully. I took my time getting out of bed, still enjoying the fresh air coming through the open window. Somewhere nearby, I could hear cowbells from a farmer's field, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful again. I was ready for a late breakfast, and my thoughts immediately returned to the plowman's lunch I had wanted at the Crown and Goose the night before. Maybe I would take a short walk first, then head back there and enjoy it properly. And then I remembered the bottle. That old green bottle behind the bar. The one marked Billy. I still had no idea what it meant, but this time I intended to ask. "Good afternoon, dearest," the barkeep called as I entered. "I be hoping you slept with the angels last night and didn't let the devils ruin the brightness of your morning." He was especially cheerful that day, and I happily soaked it in. But my thoughts quickly returned to the strange ship I had seen the day before, and to that old green bottle behind the bar. "If it's no trouble, sir, I'd love that plowman's lunch today." "'Tis no trouble at all, missy. I'll have it for you faster than you can say Blarney Stone." He grinned, laying the brogue on even thicker because he knew I enjoyed it. And I did. Within minutes, he returned with what looked like a feast: eggs, sausages and meats, pickled onions and cucumbers, aged Irish cheddar, homemade butter, chutney, and thick slices of soda bread. A pint of stout arrived with it, along with the glass of water I requested. I invited him to sit, and once he did, I finally asked the question that had been waiting since the night before. "What's the story behind that old green bottle?" His smile changed. He glanced toward the glass case. Then he began to talk. He told me about Captain Joseph Ian Darcy, about Executive Officer Samuel Harris, about Riley, about the HMS William Cross, and the terrible ordeal its crew had endured upon the sea. Heroes, he called them, every one of them. And then he mentioned something that made me stop eating: a young woman, a girl who had stood high upon the cliffs, watching the ship below.
Harris and Riley raced toward the cannons, stepping over the remains of friend and foe alike. Once there, they made their plan. Riley would fire the guns, while Harris climbed to the forecastle and signaled desperately for help. By now, people could be seen gathering along the distant shoreline. Harris raised his sword. "Now, Riley!" One after another, 10 cannons thundered across the water. As Harris searched the shore, something caught his attention high upon the cliffs. A young woman stood there alone. Her long auburn hair burned almost red beneath the morning sun, and her green dress seemed to disappear into the grass surrounding her. She raised her hand toward him. For just a moment, despite everything happening aboard the dying ship, Harris could not look away. Then Riley shouted, "Here they come, sir!" A vessel was approaching. They had been seen. Harris stood taller, believing for the first time that they might actually survive. Then cannon fire came back at them. The approaching ship had misunderstood their signal. A blast struck the William Cross. "Riley, get the boat into the water," Harris shouted. "I'll follow you. I'll try to raise a white flag." Another direct hit tore through the ship. The Cross was sinking quickly. Harris motioned for Riley to leave without him, but Riley refused. Then part of the damaged mast gave way, sending one of the fallen crewmen crashing onto the deck and into Riley's boat. The creature attacked. Riley fought desperately, but it bit him on the hand. His scream brought Harris running. Harris reached the boat, drew his sword, and killed the attacker before pulling the badly injured Riley to safety. By then, the HMS William Cross was disappearing beneath them. The approaching vessel finally reached the wreckage. Its crew had already discovered something floating in the sea. A green bottle. Billy's bottle. Inside were the notes describing what had happened aboard the William Cross. But the rescuing crew had read only enough to form their own conclusion. They saw the destroyed ship, the dead scattered among the wreckage, and 2 surviving men. Captain J.W. McCartney made his decision. Executive Officer Samuel P. Harris and shipmate Riley Begman were not welcomed aboard as survivors. They were taken into custody. Harris tried desperately to explain what had happened aboard the William Cross, but the villagers of Bally Castle had already reached their own conclusion. Nothing he said mattered. Riley, meanwhile, was growing weaker by the hour. His wound was worsening, yet he was denied proper medical care. After everything they had survived at sea, Harris could scarcely believe they had ended up imprisoned in a small cell beneath the caves near the harbor. He sat with his head in his hands and prayed that the nightmare might finally end. But someone else was refusing to accept the story being told. The young woman Harris had seen upon the cliffs had witnessed the final moments of the William Cross. Her name was Camellia, and she insisted that the authorities listen to what she had seen. They would not. When she asked to read the contents of the green bottle recovered from the sea, she was dismissed. Camellia, you've no reason to concern yourself with this. We have the man responsible. Go about your business. But Camellia knew there was more to the story, and she would not remain silent. Late that night, while she waited near the cove hoping to see Harris, someone emerged from the darkness. Billy. Camellia stared at him. Where have you been? They thought you dead. Harris and Riley need you. Billy lowered his voice. When I saw the Spaniard rise from his bed, I ran to the captain's quarters. Darcy was gone, but the door was open. I hid inside. Then he told her what he had found. On Captain Darcy's desk had been an open manifest, and within it was the truth. The Romanians were already sick before they boarded the ship, Billy said. Those responsible knew what might happen. Before the coming marriage of King Charles II, they had wanted the men removed from England, so they placed them aboard an expendable vessel, the HMS William Cross. The cargo had merely provided a reason for the voyage, and perhaps compensation for whoever might later discover what remained of the ship. They never expected survivors, Billy said. The whole voyage was meant to disappear. Billy had torn the manifest from the captain's book and placed it inside his bottle along with his own account. Then he threw the bottle into the sea. Knowing the cross was approaching land, Billy had eventually gone overboard himself, hoping he could reach shore and bring help. He had survived, but he had arrived too late. Billy looked toward the cove. They're going to blame Harris for everything, and Riley is the only other man who can tell them what happened. He hesitated. But Riley was bitten. He may not survive the night. Camelia's expression hardened. Then I need to see Harris. Billy looked at her. They won't allow it. Camellia stepped closer. Her green eyes were fixed upon him. Get me in there, Billy. She glanced toward the caves where Harris was being held. I need to see Samuel Harris. Billy managed to persuade one of the guards that he possessed further evidence, earning himself and Camellia only a few minutes with Harris and Riley. Riley was barely clinging to life. When Billy approached him, Riley thanked him for what he had done. Billy could scarcely accept the words. In his mind, he had arrived too late to save anyone. Then Harris saw Camellia. He recognized her immediately as the young woman who had stood upon the cliffs. For several moments, neither spoke. Under any other circumstances, Harris might have wondered who she was, where she lived, or whether he might see her again during his stay in Bally Castle. Instead, he stood imprisoned, accused of murdering his own captain and crew. Yet somehow, when their eyes met, everything beyond that cell seemed to disappear. Camellia knew just as certainly that she could not allow this man to die. She smiled. Harris drew her toward him, and for one brief moment they kissed. Then the guard entered. Samuel P. Harris had been found guilty of the murder of Captain Joseph Ian Darcy and the crew of the HMS William Cross. He would hang at sunrise. Camellia cried out in protest. She demanded that they read Billy's bottle, listen to Riley and hear the truth. No one would. The guard ordered Camellia and Billy from the cell. As she was taken away, Harris called after her, "Do not worry, my darling. You will see me again." Then he added, "I promise." By sunrise, the villagers had gathered beneath what they called the Justice Tree. There should have been 2 prisoners standing there that morning, but Riley had died during the night. Before he did, however, the young sailor had one final purpose. Knowing what the bite had done to him, Riley bit Harris. If Harris was going to hang, Riley intended to give him at least a chance of surviving it. And then Riley died in his arms. Now Harris stood alone beneath the rope. The sentence was read. He was condemned to be executed that morning of the 29th of June, 1661. When asked whether he had any final words, Harris answered calmly, "My God, in heaven knows what happened and what punishment I deserve. May God rest the souls lost aboard the HMS William Cross, and may God bless His Majesty and England." The men stepped forward to remove the support beneath him. Then screams erupted from the crowd. Something was emerging from the water. The undead had followed them to Bally Castle. Panic swept through the villagers. Harry struggled against the rope, while Billy rushed forward with a knife and cut him free. But Billy did not escape. One of the creatures attacked him, and within moments, the man who had preserved the truth inside that green bottle was gone. Something inside Samuel Harris changed. Whether it was Riley's final bite, rage, grief, or something far older, no one watching could explain what happened next. His eyes changed. His teeth had changed. His strength became something no ordinary man possessed. And Harris turned upon the creatures. By the time it ended, the Romanian undead that had carried the sickness aboard the William Cross were no more. Slowly, Harris returned to himself, and his first thought was, Camellia. Where is she? The villagers would not look at him. Finally, one of them pointed toward the cliffs. Harris ran. He returned to the very place where he had first seen the beautiful young woman in green waving to him from shore. But this time, Camellia was not standing above him. He found her at the bottom of the cliffs. Alive no more. Believing Harris had been executed, Camellia had never known that Riley's final act had allowed him to survive. Harry stood over the woman he had barely known, yet somehow already loved, and understood the terrible price of what Riley had given him. Samuel Harris had survived, but he might now survive forever, without her. Only afterward did the people of Bally Castle finally read everything contained within Billy's green bottle. The manifest, Billy's account, the evidence that the sick Romanians had knowingly been placed aboard the William Cross. And among those papers were notes written by Captain Joseph Ian Darcy concerning his executive officer. One passage had been overlooked. Darcy had written, "And as for this man we shall call Sontino. He is educated, capable, full of character, and possesses the integrity any Royal Naval officer would be proud to serve beside." Darcy continued that it was a pity such a man had been placed upon a voyage destined for tragedy. And his final thought was simple. May God forgive him for ever accepting Samuel P. Harris onto the roster of the HMS William Cross. From that moment forward, Samuel Harris slowly disappeared from the story, and another name took his place. Santino.
By then, I was sitting there in complete disbelief. What I had just heard was not only a story of death and horror, but of a love that had barely begun and was never meant to be. With tears in my eyes, I thanked the barkeep and slowly made my way back toward the cliffs where Camellia had once stood, looking out over the sea for Samuel Harris, or perhaps I should say, Santino. When I reached the cliffs, the emotion overcame me. I stood there crying, unable to stop it, and yet I felt no fear, only sorrow and presence. Then I felt it, the touch of a hand upon my shoulder, and a whisper, "My Camellia." Without thinking, I whispered back, "Oh, my Sontino." For one strange and fleeting moment, I felt a love so deep and so sorrowful that it hardly seemed human. Then reason returned. I told myself I was being foolish, overtired, emotional, carried away by a tragic story, told in an old Irish pub by a man I had never met before that day. So I stayed there until night had nearly taken the cliffs, and then at last I made my way back to the inn, determined to sleep and think no more of it. But as I passed through the main room, the woman at the front desk stopped me. She stared for a moment and said I looked familiar. I laughed and told her that couldn't possibly be true. I had never been there before, and after all of this, I wasn't sure I would ever return. Without a word, she pointed me toward a room just beyond the lobby, one I had not noticed before. Inside, hanging above the fireplace, was an old, cracked portrait of a young woman. The moment I saw it, I froze. It was Camellia. She was breathtakingly beautiful. Dark auburn hair, great green eyes, pale skin, soft freckles, and pearl earrings. A blue and gold scarf framed her face, while the rest of her curls spilled over her shoulders. It was clear the portrait had been painted when she was still young, before Harris, before the cliffs, before tragedy. I stood there staring at her, hardly able to breathe. Never in all my life had I seen such beauty, and I was not at all certain I ever would again.
In the years that followed, Bally Castle did its best to forget what had happened. There were no official records of Captain Joseph Ian Darcy, First Lieutenant Samuel P. Harris, or even the HMS William Cross itself. The dead from the Justice Tree were buried quietly in unmarked graves far from the harbor. Those lost at sea received no funeral. There was no memorial, no day of remembrance. Riley's mother never learned what became of her son. She knew only that he had sailed proudly from Plymouth aboard the HMS William Cross on the 11th of May, 1661. For years, she imagined that perhaps he had reached some distant land, married and begun another life. But in a mother's heart, she knew he was never coming home. Her account became one of the only remaining stories that such a ship, its officers, and its crew had ever existed at all. The Crown denied sending them, and the matter was buried, but not entirely forgotten. Billy's green bottle eventually became part of Bally Castle legend. At the Crown and Goose, visitors still hear tales of the doomed ship, the Romanian crewman, Captain Darcy, Riley, Billy, and the officer who survived them all. Local stories claim boys were named Billy and Riley in their honor. But Samuel became another matter entirely. For generations, few dared give a child that name, because the body of First Lieutenant Samuel P. Harris was never found. Some say he passed away, others say he never did. And every June, when a full moon hangs above Bally Castle harbor, strange cries are said to drift from the cliffs overlooking the sea. Some call it a banshee. The older people of Bally Castle tell a different story. They say that if you listen closely enough, it is not a banshee at all. It is Samuel Harris, Sontino, still wandering those cliffs, still calling for the woman he lost, his Camellia.
My room felt especially inviting that night. After a large meal at the Crown and Goose and an even larger story, I had completely lost track of time. It was nearly midnight. I opened the window and let the cool night air fill the room. This would be my final night at the Bally Castle Inn, and perhaps my final night in Bally Castle itself. Above the cliffs hung an enormous full moon. It seemed larger and brighter than any moon I could remember, casting its pale light across the harbor and the sea. Even the shadows seemed to move beneath it. Then the wind began carrying sounds from the cliffs. Moans, whistles, and distant cries. I stood at the window and listened. That was when I saw him. The figure of a man stood alone upon the cliff, silhouetted against the moon. He raised one arm toward the sky. Then came a bellow unlike anything I had ever heard. He stood there baying at the moon as though pleading with it, begging it to grant him something only he understood. I could not look away. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I closed the window and settled beneath the blankets of my feather bed. Before sleep found me, I said a small prayer for Camellia and for Santino. Whatever had happened in Bally Castle all those centuries ago, I knew one thing. I would take their story home with me, and I would never forget them, ever. I closed my eyes. After all, it was June, and it was time for me to go home.